Teacher's Love. A foggy morning on November 13, 2022, in a Toronto suburb seemed like any other day. Narrow streets lined with snow-covered trees were filled with the usual Sunday calm, as most residents enjoyed late breakfasts and a day of rest. But one house on the outskirts of this quiet neighborhood stood out. Police vehicles surrounded it, their flashing lights brightly reflecting off the gray facades of the nearby houses. Officers worked quietly, cordoning off the area around the old cottage, preparing for the grim scene that awaited them inside. The body of Amelia Hansen, a high school teacher, was found on the floor of her bedroom. At first glance, it seemed as though she was simply lying there motionless. But closer inspection revealed chilling details that left no doubt. This was a violent crime. Her hands were tied behind her back, and a dark mark on her neck, left by a belt, spoke of the force used against her. The look of despair and fear frozen on Amelia's face spoke to her painful final moments. This story began a few months earlier, when Amelia, a math teacher at a local school, noticed that one of her students, Jason Miller, had started showing her an unusual amount of attention. At first, it seemed harmless. Compliments, lingering looks, innocent questions about her life outside of school. But over time, Jason's interest turned into something much more, an obsession. His feelings grew day by day, and Amelia, despite being experienced and confident, could not have predicted the nightmare that lay ahead. Jason, who grew up in a troubled household, saw Amelia as the warmth and care he had always lacked. His parents were always arguing and rarely paid him any attention, and Amelia became an oasis in the desert of his cold home life. But what began as innocent admiration turned into a disturbing fixation. Jason watched Amelia, studied her daily routines, and even attended her classes without any real reason to be there. The school administration didn't notice anything unusual. Jason was a model student, and no one thought there could be anything wrong. Amelia, on the other hand, began to feel increasingly uneasy. She noticed how his gaze lingered on her, how he tried to talk to her after class, and how he was nearby even when he had no reason to be. She declined his offers to drive her home, always finding an excuse to keep her distance. But this did not deter Jason. He began following her, taking photos and recording her phone conversations. Her intuition warned her to be wary of Jason, but she could never have imagined the lengths he was willing to go. Jason had fallen in love with his teacher, and he saw her as the only bright spot in his otherwise bleak life. Amelia wanted to help him, but her attempts to set boundaries only fueled his obsession. Over the following weeks, Jason's behavior became increasingly desperate. First, there were strange gifts left on her doorstep. Bouquets of roses, which had clearly been taken from her own garden. Then came the late-night phone calls. He would stay silent, listening to her voice, her breathing. At school, he tried to keep his intentions hidden, but in private, Jason fantasized about how he could make Amelia his. Everything came to a head on that cold November evening when Jason, no longer able to contain his feelings, broke into her house. For him, it was a moment he had envisioned dozens of times. He believed that by doing this, he could rid himself of the pain that was tearing him apart inside. But when Amelia saw him at her doorstep, she felt nothing but fear. She realized that the student she had thought of as simply troubled was far more dangerous than she had imagined. Jason entered the house, locking the door behind him. In his hands was a belt, and when Amelia tried to step away, he moved forward. This time, he wasn't interested in listening to her objections. He believed he had to show her just how much he loved her, even if it was in such a twisted way. Amelia tried to resist, but her strength was no match for that of a young man driven by a dangerous obsession. Jason acted with determination, as if he were in a trance. Her cries went unheard, the streets outside were empty, and the silence of the cold November night provided a perfect cover for the horror unfolding inside her home. Within minutes, it was over. Jason stood over Amelia's body, realizing that he had done something irreversible. He thought that he had finally achieved his goal, that they would now be together forever. But instead of relief, he felt emptiness. Fear and despair began to seep into his mind. He knew that everything was over now, not just for Amelia, but for himself as well. Jason left the house as quietly as he had entered. He didn't try to cover his tracks. Deep down, he knew this was the end. In his head, Amelia's words, her screams echoed, and he couldn't silence them. He walked through the empty streets, not knowing where to go or what to do next. The only thing he understood was that his life would never be the same again. The next morning, the quiet of the Toronto suburb was shattered by the wail of police sirens. Amelia Hansen's body was discovered by neighbors who noticed her front door ajar. For Jason, that day marked the beginning of the end. The police were already on his trail, and soon he would have to face the consequences of his actions. For Detective Reed, however, it was the beginning of a complicated and tangled investigation, one that held more questions than answers. Obsession unleashed. When Amelia Hansen's body was discovered, investigators quickly realized it wasn't just a botched robbery. This was a calculated crime, committed by someone who knew her well. For Jason Miller, watching the house from a distance, hiding behind the trees, it felt like the ultimate connection, a way to finally merge with Amelia in his own twisted way. There was no love here, no genuine affection, only selfish desire and obsession. Police meticulously combed through the house, gathering every detail that might shed light on the events of that night. Neighbors described Amelia as a kind and friendly woman. Nobody could imagine that something like this could happen here, in a quiet suburb of Toronto. It seemed impossible. Who would want to harm such a beloved teacher? But for Detective Jonathan Reed, assigned to the case, the first clues started to form a picture when secret photos and notes were discovered. Hidden under Amelia's mattress, these items revealed her fear and desperation. Every photo had Jason in it, and his presence cast a dark shadow over her last months. Meanwhile, Jason had no idea his actions were about to spiral out of control. He returned home, still in a trance. In his mind, this wasn't murder. He thought they would be together forever now. He envisioned her smile, her eyes looking at him with acceptance. He wasn't acknowledging what he'd done, his mind blocking any trace of guilt or fear. The next day, chaos descended on the school where Amelia taught. Students and teachers were in disbelief. Jason, convinced he'd done something meaningful, arrived at school as though nothing had happened. He managed to blend in, masking his anxiety, but his calm demeanor was too steady. For those paying attention, it was unnerving. Detective Reed began digging into Amelia's relationships. He interviewed her colleagues and students, and Jason's name kept coming up. Teachers spoke of his obsession with Amelia, his constant attention to her lessons, and his unusual offers to help outside of school. No one knew about his late-night visits to her house, or that he had been following her, but it was clear that his feelings were far from innocent. Reed quickly realized that Jason could be key to the case. His file revealed a troubled family background, difficulty adapting socially, and a hyper-focus on Amelia, traits that painted him as someone who might be capable of extreme actions. The detective didn't waste time. He arranged to meet Jason at school. He wanted to see this young man, described by colleagues as talented but peculiar, for himself. Jason entered the principal's office where Reed was waiting, calm and composed. He sat across from Reed, his eyes fixed on the detective. Reed studied him, trying to understand what lay behind his cold gaze. Jason's answers were brief, evasive, but he denied nothing. He claimed to have always liked Amelia and insisted he would never harm her. But his eyes said otherwise. Detective Reed knew Jason wouldn't admit anything easily. The kid was clearly intelligent and understood how to behave. But as the conversation went on, Reed grew more certain that Jason was hiding something. He decided not to push too hard. Instead, he would continue observing Jason while keeping him under discreet surveillance. Jason soon noticed he was being watched. He saw the police car parked near his house and felt eyes on him as he walked to school. The world he'd tried to build, where he and Amelia could be together, was beginning to crumble. His naive confidence that he'd escape punishment was gradually replaced by panic. He could no longer sleep peacefully. Every noise outside his window made him jump. Meanwhile, Reed found another lead. He accessed security footage from neighboring houses and, upon reviewing one particular tape, noticed a figure sneaking toward Amelia's house the night before the crime. It was Jason, slowly approaching, glancing around, opening the door and slipping inside. This footage was the smoking gun, proof that he had been there that night. With all the evidence gathered, Reed knew it was time to act. He wanted to ensure Jason faced the consequences. Early the next morning, as Jason was on his way to class, officers intercepted him. He barely had time to react before cuffs were clicked onto his wrists. For Jason, it was the end of his delusion and the beginning of a nightmare of his own making. Detective Reed brought him to the station where the interrogation began. At first, Jason remained silent, hoping this was some sort of mistake, that they'd let him go. But as he was presented with the evidence, photos, surveillance footage, he had no way out. He sat there, head lowered, and finally began to talk. His confession wasn't remorseful. It was a twisted story of what he thought was love, of a need to be close that had turned into obsession. He genuinely believed he was acting out of love, not committing a crime. Listening to him, Reed realized this wasn't just a young man who had made a mistake. Jason was dangerous in his inability to distinguish reality from his fantasies. He saw Amelia not as a living person, but as an object meant to belong to him. Any rejection felt like betrayal. The next day, news of Jason Miller's arrest spread throughout the town. It was shocking for residents. A student who seemed quiet and harmless turned out to be capable of such cruelty. The school was engulfed in fear and distrust. Teachers and students avoided discussing it, but nobody could believe that someone capable of this had been among them. Jason was placed in a holding cell, unaware of what awaited him. In his mind, there was still hope that everything could be fixed, that he could return to his old life. But reality was far harsher. Investigators continued collecting evidence, witnesses gave their statements, and everything pointed to Jason never being free again. Detective Reed watched this case unfold with mixed emotions, relief and sadness. He knew he'd caught the perpetrator, but he also saw how pain and loneliness could drive someone to madness. Jason was a product of his environment, a lack of love, attention, support. But that didn't justify the horror he had brought upon Amelia and everyone who knew her. Reed decided to keep digging. He wanted to know if there had been other signs, warning signals that could have stopped Jason earlier. Perhaps then, Amelia might still be alive. But now, all he could do was seek justice for her and make sure Jason never hurt anyone again. Investigation hits a dead-end. Weeks had passed since the detention of Jason Miller. Despite what seemed like clear evidence, the case involving Amelia Hansen had started to stall. Detective Jonathan Reed felt the growing pressure both from his superiors and the public. Every day, Amelia's name appeared in newspapers and on TV, recounting her tragic fate and asking when justice would finally be served. But things were not as straightforward as they seemed. The first hurdle was the lack of direct evidence linking Jason to the exact moment of the crime. Surveillance footage showed him entering Amelia's home, but it didn't capture the actual crime. Yes, Jason was there that night, but there was no clear proof that he had committed the act. His fingerprints in the house could be explained by his previous visits, and the marks on her neck didn't match any items found in his possession. Moreover, during interrogations, Jason kept insisting that he never wanted to harm Amelia. He spoke about his love for her, how he wanted to protect her from the world. His confession was disjointed, filled with emotional statements but lacking any specific details. There was no clear acknowledgement of wrongdoing in his words. This posed a serious challenge for the investigation, as Jason's attorney began building a defense based on his emotional instability and inability to understand reality. Detective Reed, lacking other leads, decided to revisit the crime scene. He conducted further searches in Amelia's home, hoping to find something that could push the investigation forward. Every corner, every small detail was examined again, but nothing new was uncovered. Everything pointed to the fact that the perpetrator had planned well and left no traces that could be used against him. Meanwhile, Jason remained in solitary confinement, and his condition was worsening. He hardly slept, plagued by nightmares, constantly requesting to see a psychologist. His attorney took advantage of this, insisting on a psychiatric evaluation. The results showed that Jason suffered from severe trauma-related issues, stemming from childhood and difficulties in social interaction. This could be the foundation for his defense in court, further complicating the case. Reed began to feel like all his efforts were in vain. He knew Jason was guilty, but proving it was becoming nearly impossible. He needed something that could turn the tide of the investigation. He decided to talk to Amelia's neighbors again, hoping that someone might have noticed something unusual on the night of the crime that hadn't been mentioned earlier. But all the answers were the same. Nobody saw or heard anything. Around this time, Reed received information from the forensic team stating that the DNA analyses were inconclusive. The samples found at the scene were mixed, making it impossible to determine with certainty whether they belonged to Jason. This was yet another blow to a case that was already falling apart. The detective needed something that could prove Jason's guilt beyond doubt, but every step forward seemed to lead to 2 steps back. At the same time, problems were also surfacing at the local school. Teachers and students were frightened, with many parents pulling their children out, demanding answers and safety. The school administration tried to regain control, but each day brought new challenges. Teachers who knew Jason couldn't believe that such a quiet, smart young man could be capable of such an act. This atmosphere of mistrust and fear only added to the pressure on Reed. One evening, after another fruitless day, Detective Reed realized he needed to approach the case from a different angle. He decided to meet with the psychologist who had been working with Jason to better understand his motives and perhaps find a clue he had missed. The psychologist spoke of Jason's deep issues, his need for love and attention, and how he had idealized Amelia, seeing her as the only light in his life. It was a story of a twisted, unhealthy love that had led to tragedy. Reed understood that Jason was not a typical criminal. His motives didn't fit the usual profile, which made the case even more complex. He began reviewing old records of other obsession-driven cases similar to this one, trying to find parallels and understand how he could prove Jason's guilt. But all these efforts led to new dead ends. Time passed, and the investigation remained stuck. The public began losing faith in the police. Journalists wrote articles criticizing the investigation's incompetence, and Reed's superiors increasingly demanded results. But the detective wouldn't give up. He knew the truth was out there, that he had to find a way to prove Jason was guilty. He could feel it, but the evidence kept slipping away. One night, sitting at his desk, Reed decided to re-watch all the surveillance footage. He knew he had seen something important but might not have given it enough attention. He replayed the footage of Jason approaching Amelia's house, slowly, frame by frame. And then he noticed something he had missed before. A shadow flickering in the window of the neighboring house. It could have been anything, a reflection, an animal. But Reed decided to follow up. The next day he went to the neighbors and asked for access to the camera they had installed in their yard. The camera was aimed at the side of Amelia's house and might have captured something that the other cameras had missed. Detective Jonathan Reed was given a glimmer of hope after spotting a blurry figure on a surveillance video that appeared near Amelia's house shortly after Jason arrived. This discovery suggested there was another element in the case that could shed light on what had happened, and perhaps even exonerate Jason. Though the footage was unclear, Reed knew this lead was worth pursuing. The next day, Reed assembled a team of officers and returned to the area to conduct a more thorough examination. The camera that had captured the figure was positioned in a neighboring garden, covering an angle of Amelia's house that wasn't visible from other cameras. This meant someone could have entered or left the house without being recorded elsewhere. Reed decided to identify the mysterious person. He began by checking the time on the footage and questioning neighbors to see if they had noticed anything unusual that night. Unfortunately, the neighbors said they had neither seen nor heard anything suspicious, which left Reed in a challenging position. The only option was to enhance the video to identify the unknown individual. To achieve this, Reed contacted digital video experts. The technicians worked tirelessly to improve the footage's quality, applying all available technology to make it clearer. After several days of effort, they managed to make out a few details. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, and their height roughly matched that of an adult male. This made Reed consider the possibility that someone other than Jason could have had a motive to harm Amelia. Reed also decided to revisit the statements given by Amelia's neighbors and acquaintances. He interviewed those who knew her well, trying to find out if she had any enemies or anyone who wished her harm. During these interviews, Reed met a woman named Karen, who mentioned seeing an unfamiliar car parked near Amelia's house about a week before the incident. The car was described as an old black model, and Karen remembered that the driver seemed suspicious, watching the house. This information made Reed wonder if there was a connection between the car and the figure on the video. He decided to contact the Department of Motor Vehicles, DMV, to look up cars matching the description that were registered in the area. The search was long and tedious, but eventually a few possible matches were found. One of these vehicles belonged to a man named Mark Lambert, who had previously been involved in a dispute with Amelia. Reed didn't know much about Lambert at first, but it quickly became clear that he needed to dig deeper into his background. Mark Lambert had been a former colleague of Amelia's, working at the same school years earlier. He had left the job following disagreements with the administration and some colleagues. Rumor had it that Lambert had tried to rekindle a relationship with Amelia, but she had turned him down. This rejection led to tension, and Lambert had even allegedly threatened her. This discovery was a major breakthrough for Reed. He now had a potential suspect with both a motive and an opportunity. Reed decided to find Lambert and question him. However, when he arrived at Lambert's address, Mark was gone. Neighbors reported not seeing him for several days, and the house appeared abandoned. This added yet another layer of mystery to the case. Reed ordered a search of Lambert's house. During the search, several personal items belonging to Amelia were found. An old school yearbook with her notes, and a few photographs of her and Lambert together. These items suggested that Lambert might have been involved in the crime. Additionally, among the documents found in the house was a letter written by Lambert, expressing his hatred and jealousy towards Jason, blaming him for Amelia's rejection. Reed now had more evidence pointing towards Lambert as a second suspect. However, without Lambert himself, it all remained circumstantial. Reed began looking for any clues that might lead to Lambert's whereabouts. He requested records of Lambert's bank transactions, phone calls, and any other actions that might help track him down. Despite these efforts, Lambert seemed to have vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, Jason's attorney learned of the new developments and began promoting the idea that his client couldn't have been the sole perpetrator. This complicated the case but also gave Reed another opportunity to dig deeper. Reed focused on tracking all of Lambert's connections, trying to determine where he might have gone. Eventually, Reed found an old friend of Lambert's, who said that Mark had mentioned wanting to get away for a while to clear his head. Reed continued searching for Lambert, aware that time was working against him. Then, something unexpected happened. A local resident called the police, claiming to have seen someone matching Lambert's description at an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Reed quickly organized a team for the operation. When the officers arrived at the warehouse, they found Mark hiding in one of the storage rooms. Lambert was visibly shaken and offered no resistance during his arrest. Upon searching him, they found a set of keys to Amelia's house, as well as a journal in which he detailed his thoughts and feelings about her. In the journal, he confessed he couldn't handle Amelia's rejection and saw her death as a form of liberation for both of them. After Lambert's arrest, the case took a new turn. Now, Reed could prove that Jason wasn't the only one involved in the tragedy. Mark Lambert was the missing link needed to complete the story. His confession and the evidence found were decisive. Lambert admitted that he had seen Jason enter Amelia's house that night, and that's when he decided to act. In his twisted imagination, he believed he was saving Amelia from what he called an obsessed teenager. These admissions clarified what had happened. Jason had indeed entered Amelia's house to see her one last time, but couldn't bring himself to harm her. He was overwhelmed by her fear, and eventually left without touching her. It was after this that Lambert entered the house and committed the crime, believing only he had the right to decide Amelia's fate. Trial and sentencing. Several months after Mark Lambert's arrest, the long-awaited trial finally began. The public, eager for justice, gathered outside the courthouse, waiting for the outcome of this high-profile case. Journalists filled the area, capturing every moment. Everyone wanted to know how the story, which began with the tragic death of schoolteacher Amelia Hansen, would end. Detective Jonathan Reed, who had been on the case from the start, was present in the courtroom, watching the proceedings. He knew he had done everything in his power to gather enough evidence against Lambert. Yet despite all his efforts, an uneasy feeling lingered. The The trial was the moment when all his work could either lead to a well-deserved punishment or end in failure. The trial began with the prosecution's statement. The prosecutor laid out all the facts, starting from the discovery of Amelia's body and ending with Mark Lambert's arrest. The prosecutor spoke of Lambert's jealousy, his past conflict with Amelia, the personal items of Amelia's found in his home, and the diary where he wrote about his desire to free her. All of this painted an undeniable picture of a premeditated crime committed by someone who had lost touch with reality. The prosecutor also mentioned Jason Miller, the teenager initially suspected in the crime. Jason was portrayed as a victim of manipulation and harassment by Lambert. The prosecution emphasized that Jason had broken into Amelia's house, but did not act violently, and that Mark Lambert used the situation to carry out his terrible plan. Then Lambert's defense took the floor. Lambert's lawyer tried to present his client as a person struggling with a mental disorder. He argued that Lambert was incapable of understanding his actions, and that his behavior was a result of prolonged psychological issues and emotional turmoil. The defense insisted that Lambert needed treatment, not punishment, and tried to convince the court that his actions were not driven by malice, but by a desperate attempt to cope with his own pain. Witnesses were called to testify. Amelia's colleagues spoke about her relationship with Mark, about how he stalked her after being fired from the school. Some recalled Amelia complaining about Lambert's strange behavior, his obsessive attempts to communicate with her, which she rejected. Karen, a neighbor, also testified, saying she had seen a suspicious car near Amelia's house. Her testimony confirmed that Lambert had been watching Amelia a week before the crime. Jason Miller also took the stand. He spoke of his admiration for Amelia, how she became an important figure in his life, and how his feelings gradually got out of control. He admitted he was obsessed with her and had broken into her house that night, but upon seeing her fear, couldn't bring himself to harm her. Jason spoke of his regret, how it pained him to realize that his actions led to the tragedy. His sincere words moved many in the courtroom, but they didn't change the fact that Lambert was the one who committed the crime. One of the key moments in the trial was the presentation by the experts. Specialists in video recordings presented an enhanced version of the footage showing Lambert approaching Amelia's house after Jason had left the scene. This footage became the decisive evidence that Lambert was the one who committed the crime. Experts also confirmed that the handwriting in the threatening letter found in Lambert's home was his, which further solidified the prosecution's case. Psychiatric evaluation confirmed that Lambert suffered from a serious personality disorder, but was capable of understanding his actions and their consequences. This conclusion was the final nail in the coffin for his defense. The judge and jury understood that Lambert had consciously and coldly planned the crime, and no internal turmoil could justify such cruelty. After several days of hearings, the judge retired to deliver the verdict. A tense silence filled the courtroom. Amelia's family sat in anticipation, their faces reflecting a mix of hope and fear. Jason, surrounded by his parents, kept his head down, seemingly afraid to hear the verdict. Detective Reed, sitting in the corner of the room, silently observed, his mind filled with memories of how he had investigated the case, how he had come closer to the truth, step by step. Finally, the judge returned, and the room held its breath. He announced that Mark Lambert was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that Lambert's actions were cold-blooded and cruel, that he had used the weakness of others to carry out his plan, and that society needed to be protected from individuals like him. The verdict was met with silence, which after a few seconds was replaced by quiet sobs and sighs of relief. Amelia's family hugged each other, trying to find comfort in knowing that the guilty party would be punished. Jason, despite being cleared of murder charges, didn't feel relieved. He understood that his actions had become part of the chain of events that led to Amelia's death. He knew he had a long road to forgiveness ahead of him, and this verdict was only the beginning of his own internal trial. After the trial, Detective Reed felt both relieved and empty. He had achieved justice for Amelia, but he knew it wouldn't bring her back. His mind was full of questions with no answers. He knew he had done everything he could, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the tragedy could have been prevented. He decided to dedicate his life to ensuring that such cases never happened again, and he continued working on a program to prevent violence and obsession in schools. Jason Miller spent several months in a rehabilitation center after the trial, continuing to work on his emotional issues. He realized that his journey was just beginning and that he needed to use his experience to help others. He enrolled in college to study psychology and began volunteering to support teenagers facing emotional challenges. He wanted to believe that he could change his life and do something good to atone for his actions. Mark Lambert, while in prison, never admitted his guilt. He remained trapped in his illusions, continuing to believe that his actions were justified. His fate became an example of how dangerous obsession can be when it turns into a destructive force, and how important it is to seek help in time to prevent a tragedy. Amelia Hansen's story became a lesson for many. It showed how fragile human life is, and how easily it can be destroyed if warning signs are ignored. Love and attachment can be beautiful emotions, but when they turn into obsession, they become dangerous. Amelia believed in people, and that trust, unfortunately, played a cruel trick on her. For Detective Reed, this case was the most difficult of his career. It forced him to reconsider many things, but it also gave him a purpose that went beyond regular police work. He realized that his job was not only to catch criminals, but also to prevent crimes, to help people understand each other, and to teach them how to protect themselves. This tragedy left a deep mark on the hearts of everyone connected to it. But from this grief emerged something important: the understanding that love must be healthy, that no one has the right to possess another person, that boundaries matter, and that personal feelings must be respected. Amelia Hansen's story was not forgotten. Her name became a symbol of the fight for safety, for the right to live without fear and threats.